Step into the realm of limitless imagination with Beyond the Art, where Indigenous creativity knows no bounds. Join us on a captivating journey through Indigenous art and innovation.
Together, let's delve into the depths of imagination, pushing boundaries with guests from diverse sectors of the Native American art world, each sharing their unique creative vision and inspiring journeys.
Join us for exclusive interviews, thought-provoking discussions, and uplifting stories.
Jeffrey, hi. We're really excited to have you on the show. To start, can you tell us a little bit about your backgrounds, how your diverse upbringing influenced your art journey?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. And I'm Jeffrey Gibson. I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I live in the Hudson Valley in New York, and I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation in Mississippi, and my mother is Cherokee. And, my parents, my dad was drafted into the Vietnam War. And then from there, that brought him into working for the government. He was a civil engineer, and we moved around probably every 2 or 3 years during my childhood. So I think I was born in Colorado. And then we quickly moved we've lived in Texas, we've lived in North Carolina, we've lived in a couple of places in Germany, New Jersey, and then Korea, and then Maryland. And then from there, I went to school in Washington, D.C., Chicago. I moved to London for graduate school. And then ultimately, I moved to New York City, where I lived for about 14 years before moving upstate. And so I've been up here now since 2012. I think the best way I would describe how I think and what I do is really as a collage artist. So in any medium I'm working in, I'm a big collector of materials. Sometimes that's sound, sometimes that's words, sometimes it's color, pattern, and just different kinds of material as well. And even I would say like ideas. I think just sort of shifting, having moved around so much, like these kind of shifting ideas of when you're a member of, where you're at, when you actually are a resident of where you're at. And also, I think equally important when you're an outsider and when you're a foreigner, you're visiting someplace that is not your home, has also influenced a lot of how I think about what I do. And for the most part, I would say even now, I think a lot of it is a form of storytelling through materials and through these kind of shifting positions in relationships. Certainly Native American history, material history, art history, aesthetic history has been such a huge influence on me. And I did in the early 90s work as a research assistant on NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And that was while I was going to art school studying painting at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I think that was a really tough combination, but ultimately the challenges of trying to coexist in those two worlds and everything that comes with them set up a lot of problems that I've been unpacking since then through art making, so we can talk more about that. But I would say that's kind of the kernel that I keep returning to when I think about how I make art.
I think there's something to be said about how the knowledge that a lot of Native American and Indigenous college students gain and how to handle that new knowledge of that traumatic history that we as a people have experienced and how that affects us moving forward in our careers.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I'm actually getting ready to go back to the Choctaw Reservation next Saturday at the invitation of our tribal chief, Chief Cyrus Ben, who came to Venice to help celebrate the opening of the pavilion with me. And they have acquired a print that they're going to install in the Heritage Center there. They're also acquiring a wallpaper that I've designed that will go behind it. And so I'm going down for the Choctaw Fair, which is the annual cultural fair that happens there. And it's, I think it is definitely a homecoming. I've always kind of said to myself that I want to return being my whole self. So, and many times I have not always felt very comfortable there. But I think Chief Cyrus Ben was really incredibly welcoming, and I think his invitation is one that is such an honor. But it is sort of, it's sort of, when I say a homecoming, it is kind of the full circle moment of that trauma that we all share, coming to a place of like a next step. I don't know if I would call it resolution, but I would definitely call it like a next step. And that feels really great.
That's a really great way of putting that, actually. Yeah. So you do have this rich cultural heritage, being a member of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians and of Cherokee descent. How has that shaped your artistic vision and the stories you tell through your work?
Well, there's, I think when I think about like the tribes that I come from, one of the things that comes so quickly to me is that, we're really talking about the American South in terms of the periods that my families that I have met personally have lived there. So in Mississippi, my family lives in Conehatta and on the reservation at this point, but my dad was raised in Conehatta, one of the Choctaw communities outside of the reservation. And I think, the racial histories of Mississippi are really impactful on I think everyone who lived in Mississippi during that time. And in Oklahoma as well. I think the racism in particular of the 20th century in both of those states. The other thing I think has been really impactful on my thinking is the Dawes Commission and the land allotment and the land grabbing and sort of how that impacted not only my family, but the entire communities that were there. I think how, and I'm kind of just listing like the highlights of things that I know have been really impactful on my thinking. I think also all of the forced relocation and pushing Native people to the center of the country and creating Indian country, which ultimately then leads to the state of Oklahoma. I think that in a political sense of, what it did to both Native people and non-Native people and how the U.S. benefited from being able to basically then abandon Indian country and to take it over as states to develop it. So I think there's that, right, which is much more about American history and sort of what role my ancestors and my family have played in that and how they've been affected by it. And I think a lot of it is about the recovery that is necessary to happen from those incidents. My uncles on my dad's side would talk about, hand codes in Mississippi to talk about where there was people waiting to like jump either African-American people or Native people on certain roads, where there were church burnings happening. It just simply has a history of violence that still resonates today. And even we live in a day and age today where people are still trying to invoke that fear in people. So it's still, for me, very present. And then, of course, I think when I think about the indigenous cultures of the Cherokee people and the Choctaw people, I love to remember and remind myself of the strength of survival in the face of adversity, which comes in many forms, right? It comes in the form of dancing, it comes in the form of prayer, it comes in the form of ceremony, it comes in the form of language and food and farming and community building. I think that is something that I hope all Indigenous people realize about our histories, is that, it's it's in spite of challenges that we are still here. It's like, it's an incredible story of survival and invention and determination and resistance, and not always in the most obvious ways. I think Venice in particular really, it's kind of like a boot camp for an artist, I think, going through the Venice process. And one of the things that has made me do is really put words to things that probably in the past I've been, I reference things or I'll speak lightly of things. But with Venice, one of the things I had to think about was the topic of beauty. And I think about the history of Indigenous people who have made such labor-intensive, beautiful, time-consuming things, and during times of such extreme duress, this level of making didn't really cease. And it's like, why? It seems so counterintuitive. Why would you make something that's so invested during times when literally like food and shelter were at stake? And I think that those are objects that are these microcosms of hope and freedom, and of kind of a manifestation of a return to an empowered place. And that's how I've begun to see those historical objects. And I think it's so then I start looking back at like sort of what Choctaw people and Cherokee people have made, and Indigenous people of all nations, what the things that we've made with the materials that were at hand. You kind of walk backwards, right, from the 20th century, 19th century, 18th century, and backwards. And you see the influence of global trade, of people moving through, of aesthetic influence, cultural influence. I think Venice also, the exhibition in Venice really forced me to want to acknowledge the makers of these objects, whom we don't know their names, we don't know the stories. But when I look at these objects, one of the things that we never talk about is the integrity of the maker, that this maker had options in terms of what they were making with, what materials they were bringing into the objects they were making. And so, beads are not really traditional. Like if we're talking about sort of the original traditions, like beads replaced many things. And that was a choice. It was a choice. Beads became very, very valuable for the look of them, for the material itself. But I think it's important that we give those makers the integrity that they were making aesthetic choices, they were making material choices, and to try to give them the integrity of being an individual creative thinker and maker as much as we possibly can, even if we don't know their names. So yeah, and then right now, I mean, this is post museum or Venice exhibition. Right now, I've really become interested in pre-Columbian and pre-contact objects that people have made, which is something that what I didn't know when I started thinking about that was the influence of Indigenous people on other Indigenous communities. So we're still kind of in this way of being spoken about, and oftentimes speaking of ourselves. Even I'm doing it in this conversation. When I say Indigenous and Native American, we're talking about hundreds of different tribal nations, hundreds of different languages, and hundreds of different ways of looking at the world and making things. And so I'm really interested in like looking at like how one tribal nation's way of making and aesthetics and their kind of bigger perspectives on their relationships to the world influenced others. And it's its own kind of trade. It's almost like somehow we think about trade as happening post contact. Well, at least that's the way it's spoken about oftentimes in art contexts. But there's something really interesting about what happened before that to me lately.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's really interesting. I was privy to conversations when I was younger about that type of thing. How we had I'm from the Northern Plains, and how we had obsidian stones that clearly did not come from the Northern Plains, and so I think that's a fascinating topic to go down.
Yeah, and even thinking about between the continents. I mean, even like the way that we refer to the borders, the land borders that we acknowledge, or the geographic borders now. I mean, it's interesting to think how much the materials traversed all of these borders, and I think my goal is not in any way to paint this sort of like totally harmonious coexistence, because that wasn't always the case either. But I think that, again, you know, when I look at, so for instance, the Mississippian culture in the middle of North America, you know, which is where the Choctaw would have emerged from, and looking at the Mississippian cultural imagery, and there are conversations about whether it traveled north or traveled south. So this imagery would have influenced Mayan and Aztec cultures, or if it would have come north and been the reverse. From what I understand, or what I've been told most recently, is that I guess the current belief is that it more originated in the Southeast and then would have moved south, which is like fascinating to me. It's like,
so let's dive into your artistic journey. What initially drew you to painting, and how did you transition into becoming a more interdisciplinary artist?
I think, painting, I think for a lot of people who don't grow up with an artist in the family or an understanding of contemporary art, the kind of basic building blocks that most people are familiar with are drawing, painting, sculpture. And I think for me, that was the case. It's the thing that I understood the most, making a picture, making an image. It's kind of most readily available. When I was a kid, my mother would give me crayons and paper. I think it was a big deal when I got pastels and, things that I could feel like I was making like a more mature decision as an artist, as a teenager. And my relatives would give me, they would introduce me to like local artists, like in Oklahoma or in Mississippi, and they would show me postcards of their work that were for sale at the local, cultural center, and I would copy them. And some of those I would give to family members. And so that was probably what, and then of course, you get recognized as the artist in the family. And I also got praised as the artist in the family. And so it became something that was enjoyable. It like hit all the right bells of like feeling good about creating something. Both of my grandmothers always made things. They were, I would say, they made like, domestic craft. So I know that there was, in my family, there was jewelry making, basketry. There was singing. There was sewing, quilting, applique work. And then my mother's mother, Annie Wilson, she was a real crafter. So she was like, she would go to like tag sales and go buy things and clean them up and remake them in ways and either give them away or sell them. And so I think when I look at what they made, it kind of, at least, there's this kind of cloud of things that I would, in my own background, that I would throw into the kind of basket of like things that are possible, things that you could possibly make. And I think for me, when I started, I stayed in painting for the whole time, through all of high school, college, even going to graduate school, I was still painting. And it was in graduate school where I started experimenting with some sculptural forms, some textiles. I was making dolls. Actually, in undergrad, I made a couple of dolls that I think when I made them, and they were representative, the first set of dolls that I made were actually representative of white folks going to powwows. And I remember I worked at the Field Museum, and there was a woman who was always at powwows. I don't remember her name. She presented, non-native, but she had the most beautiful buckskin, fully beaded dress on that she would bring out at powwows. And I remember my friend Mavis Nakanish said to me, she said, "Oh, she copied that from a dress that's in the Field Museum." She said these rich white folks come in and they will hire someone to make that dress and they don't know anything about it. And so my first doll was that woman. It was a blonde-haired little rag doll that I put into some fabric that had sort of like a Native American print on it. and she had blonde braids. And I took it into one of my professors who I really loved, named Maureen Sherlock, who's no longer with us. And she just kind of flipped out over it. She just thought it was the most brilliant thing, and she wanted to introduce me to people, and she knew people who would want to show it. And this was the 90s. So this was kind of when identity politics were like really raging. Like people were really, that's what was going on. And I kind of freaked out. Like I just wasn't ready for that kind of attention. Like I'm actually inherently kind of a shy person who really does not like attention. And so I didn't make another doll. And then I made another doll when I moved to London. And it was a rag doll that I based off of my cousin, Sonny Wilson, who lives in Oklahoma. And, you know, I made this doll and I took it in a suitcase and I packed it. I took it to the US. I did a road trip across country. And I would take this doll out and I would photograph it in different places. And I was thinking about how the different places that we occupy really inform a body. Like they make the body what the meaning of the body becomes is informed by where we go, you know, and what we do. So it had, when I showed it, it was a large life-size rag doll, and it had a photo album with it of all the places where I'd photographed it. So it wasn't actually, oh, and then I made dolls actually for my thesis show, actually in graduate school. And the patterns were based off of people who I knew. And they were leaning towards kind of fantasy. So I guess that's kind of always been with me. I think the big change that people are familiar with is really when I started bringing in people bringing in materials that are very recognizable as like Native American referencing materials. So the first time I painted on hide, I was at a point of frustration because, you know, I was making abstract paintings where in my mind, I was thinking about basketry and weaving, beadwork and stretching of hides. And people just saw them as formal abstractions. And that was really unsatisfying to me. So it felt like a real act of like defiance to kind of suddenly go like, well, I'm going to paint on hide stretched over a wood panel. And I did. And it's a beautiful surface to paint on. But when I showed them, what was interesting was I didn't have to introduce the reference at all. Like people immediately understood that it was coming from a completely different history. And that was amazing. It was very freeing to feel that the material itself was doing the work that I had been trying to accomplish so hard, you know, leading up to that point. And then that eventually opened up to, you know, looking at powwow vendors. Like it was like going to an art supply store, like when I would go around the markets at powwows. And, you know, it seems crazy. At first you're like, oh, can I buy 10 yards of ribbon? And you go back and you're like, can I buy 10 rolls of ribbon? You know, and then you start using it in ways that you would never use if somebody was creating regalia. You know, it starts borrowing from different kinds of modern and contemporary art histories where the practicality or the kind of utility of it doesn't really have to exist anymore. And that's kind of where it started from. And I think that, again, that freedom of people being able to see it so immediately, it just kind of moved me forward in that relationship of what I make and how viewers encounter it. You know, I didn't have to fight so hard for the reading.
Yeah, because you did study at the School of Art Institute in Chicago and the Royal College of Arts in London.
Yeah.
And I guess you have touched a little bit on this and how these experiences influenced your approach to art.
Yeah.
What would you say is a takeaway from your London experience in grad school?
I think it had a lot to do with the time, you know, in the United States at the time, right? So I went to London in 1996. I went to undergraduate I was in Chicago from like 90, let me see, it would have been 92, 93, 94, graduated in 95. And, you know, there was a couple of things going on in the country at the time that I don't know how much I was totally aware of it, or at least I was aware of them. I didn't know how it really impacted me. One was the AIDS crisis. And I think that that is something that I would hear about in the news, but I didn't understand really what was happening. You know, and looking back, you understand now that that was a hugely homophobic, politicized time. You know, the pharmaceutical industry is involved, the government's involved. There's censorship issues happening with the National Endowment for the Arts, right? So there was all of these things happening. There were culture wars. I don't know if I, as a 20-year-old at the time, knew what a culture war meant, or like really like where I was between them. I think also, so when I went to London, it was a very different environment. People were not interested in where you came from. People were not interested. I mean, there was a comparison. People were concerned about class. So there was like working class and middle class, and then all of the class structure of the UK. And I couldn't really relate to that. Not that we don't have class in the US, but we don't talk about it in the same terms. And so for me to get there and to really have no community to discuss issues of identity with was bizarrely a sense of relief. You know, I'm one of those kids, as many Indigenous folks who grow up get the question, what are you? What are you? What are you? Everywhere you go, right? And suddenly that question didn't matter anymore to people. When I was in the UK, most people presumed that I was Black, and there was a group of African students at Royal College who became really some of my best friends who were there, and brought me into UK African culture in the UK, and I had a blast. Like I mean, music's always been an important thing for me. When I was in Chicago house was like what I was totally into, and would attend, you know, go to clubs like every single week, if not multiple times a week. And when I went to the UK, suddenly it was like moving into like drum and bass. And drum and bass was happening there, and a whole different kind of like pop music. So it was kind of like I got to put down all of the weight that Indigenous people are asked to carry, or maybe we feel compelled to carry, responsible to carry here in the US. And suddenly I got to put it down. And there's a little bit of annoyance in that, but also there is sort of like, oh, wow, I can actually go to a museum and look at painting. You know, I can actually learn about a technical ability of painting, as opposed to it always being content driven. Like, what is the image, and like, what does it mean? So that was great. And I think, you know, the UK is kind of easy. It's a little deceptive because it's English and English. So it feels like you understand, but then it's culturally so different. So then, of course, at a certain point, you're kind of like, I just don't understand British culture. So after about 3 years, I was ready to return. I was ready to come back to the US.
So you first visited the Venice Biennale in 2007. Mm-hmm. And when you were first starting out, what was that experience like for you? How did that influence your career?
Well, I think, so I had been before. So I think when I was at Royal College, we went as like a class trip. But the 2007 visit was the Smithsonian, the National Museum of the American Indian, actually funded for, I believe it was about 50 young artists and art professionals to come to Venice. I believe it was, I always get the dates wrong. I believe it was James Luna in 2007 that they did a collateral project with. And then in 2009, they did a collateral project with Edgar Hoover's. I believe that's correct. I could be wrong. It could be 2005 and 2007. I get confused. But so I went over, and I think, and that's how I met Kathleen. I knew her since 2002, and she's the one who was responsible for inviting me. I went over, and, you know, it is this immediate feeling of feeling selected, feeling like someone sees promise in you, someone acknowledges you as being necessary towards a future of growth for a larger community. I think there's I didn't really know what to do with myself. I was there. I knew some people. I knew some artists. And then it's all the events after the talk, right? It's the dinners, it's the hotel rooms, and like people just hanging out afterwards. And, of course, a lot of these artists, the more established artists, I'm kind of in awe of. So it's also this like nerve-wracking time of like, I should not bother them. And then suddenly they look over and they like wave you over and they want to like share a spritz with you, and just ask you who you are. So all of this kind of bonding happens. I think in a way that I think is hugely beneficial for people. Like there's nothing you can experience that matches that kind of invitation and the amount of generosity that it takes, for someone to invite you to an event like that. Because they're not inviting you. We invited a lot of people this time. And I know for at least the young people and for people who otherwise may not go, it's really so they understand how much we value them in this kind of larger equation. That's really the reason why it's important to me to invite people. And that they were very much selected. Like these are people who, we were like, we want these people to attend. Of course, if we had endless money, we would have had hundreds of people come. But with what we were able to fundraise for, we still had a significant amount of people come. But that was the first time when I went, and it really, I remember Kathleen and I were friends. We went to a couple of parties together. I remember we went to the Canadian Pavilion party, and it was like kind of blew my mind, like pulling into this massive palazzo. I think Kathleen remembers that we had conversations like, what if one day we could do this? Like, what if one day, Jeff, you represent the US? And I think, you just kind of like giggle it away. You just kind of were like, but I am an ambitious person, and I'm sure that a seed was planted. And then probably about 10 years ago, people started saying, hey, have you ever thought about proposing for the Biennale? And I'm the one who has always said, I don't think the timing is right, And this is the first time that when Abigail Winograd, the co-curator, called me from Venice and said, why aren't you here? And I said, are you serious? And she said, yeah. She's like, why aren't you here? And I said, well, if you wanted to do this, and I said, I would want Kathleen involved, I would be open to talking about it. And that was in 2023.
Okay. Well, for our listeners, we're talking about Kathleen Esch-Milby, who is an amazing curator and a friend to both of us.
Yeah.
So let's fast forward to now, and you're representing the United States at this year's Biennale. How does it feel to come full circle and to be the first Indigenous artist to have a solo show at the U.S. Pavilion?
Well, I think it's kind of still unfolding in my life and in my head. I think, I talk to a lot of Indigenous artists, and things are definitely happening at like a record pace right now, not just for me, but just for Indigenous artists globally. There's more attention being paid. There's artists who are in museums, museum exhibitions, books coming out, more than I've ever seen before. So that's the moment that we're in. And not that there can't be more even, but I think the pressure of it being the first is something that I think for a lot of Indigenous artists, it's sort of like, well, I don't want there just to be a first. Like, how do we set up for like the second and the third and the fourth? And this question that I've grown up with of just like, is it pigeonholing to identify as a Native artist? Like, do you want to be known as a Native artist, or is it just an artist? And all of these kind of questions. I think we're opening up possibilities that those questions will become more complex in a very positive way. I do think that for some people, maybe there won't be any reason to identify their work as of an Indigenous artist. For me, it is a point of pride. It started off as a real effort towards representation, where I feel like if I didn't carry that with me, one, I would be offending my tribe. I would be offending my tribal chief, who funded my education. I mean, I would be offending my parents. I would be, I think, disrespecting myself. I would feel fair to say. I think that would. So that's one of the reasons why I've carried it with me. And to be honest, when people have said to me, like, "Do you feel like it pigeonholes you?" I feel like there's an ignorance in that statement that somehow, like, why not think that indigeneity is larger than anything else? Why not think that indigeneity offers more to the world than anything else? It's the opposite of pigeonholing. Why not see it as this like gateway to like abundance, for everybody?
Would you be able to tell us about the work that you created for the Venice Biennale, and what do you hope to convey through it?
Yeah. I mean, I had a whole other different proposal before we landed on what eventually was made and shown. It was originally going to be a video installation that focused on Indigenous women specifically. And I went to the pavilion in 2023, and I walked through and I realized that proposal would not have worked in that space. The sound wouldn't have worked. I think it was difficult. It's not the best kind of space to look at video, not a full immersive video installation. But that building is really set up for painting and sculpture. And so that was the very first thing I took away. And I thought, I'm going to maybe look at this as like a time to not reinvent or really like go too far out of things that I'm confident in, but like, let's look at what are the works that I've made that I feel really strongly about. Also, the other realization was that it's an international audience. So I want to speak to that international audience, which then, of course, led me to, I'm representing the United States. And so there's a history of the United States. There's a history of the United States in the Biennale. There's a history of the United States as like a kind of powerful nation in the world. What role do I play in it? And I think that's what eventually, it compelled me to look at where Indigenous people show up in American history and to use that as the basis. I mean, the sculpture that you first encounter outside is a conglomeration of a lot of different, very classical monument pedestal sculptures. And they've been turned, there's about 12 of them, I think, that have been kind of mashed into like one form that people can perform on. And my use of pedestals and platforms and stages and things like that have really been about really in response to the idea of like a monument being like a fixed point in history that usually speaks to a small handful of people. It usually celebrates whatever the mainstream kind of historical thread is. It's not always representative of all the people who were impacted. So if we just have a space that can be public and rotating, can we bring what has been historically marginalized? Can we centralize it? Can we give that space a voice? But also a space where things can change, where things can change in real time. So that's really where it starts. The title of the exhibition is The Space in Which to Place Me, which is a line from a poem by Layli Long Soldier. And this kind of begins where, I wanted to continue the kinds of collaborations that I do, which, that's a whole nother conversation. But in this sense, I always am like trying to pay attention to what other Indigenous artists are doing. And rather than me necessarily trying to mirror them or even take inspiration from them, like, let's just invite them in to do what they're already doing. That's already really incredible. Like, So I've been a fan of Layli's work for a really long time, and I knew that I wanted to, we have collaborated in other ways previously, but I knew when I read that poem, Hisepa, I knew that I really wanted to bring her in. And then you go in, all of the texts were found. I started looking at founding documents of the United States. Ultimately, that leads into different kinds of amendments, ratified amendments, not ratified amendments, civil rights histories, feminist histories, queer histories, speeches, and some songs. There are figurative sculptures, kind of, I call them ancestral spirit figures that you first encounter. There are murals. I wanted to include murals because, in Mississippi and Oklahoma, as a child growing up, there were a lot of buildings that I remember having tons of murals inside of them, and you never knew who painted. Well, local people would know who painted them, but they were never documented. We have no record of them. Those buildings were destroyed, and they were always in civic spaces. And I remember seeing lots of like birds and mountains and sort of like images of tribal people in celebratory, empowering ways, and I've seen that in the Dakotas, like at gyms and churches, and in New Mexico, I see it all over the place at boarding schools. So I wanted to do proper murals so that they're kind of throughout the whole building. Then there's paintings. There are painted works on paper that have historical or vintage beaded objects placed within them. I wanted to highlight those individuals. And there's a punching bag. There's some other sculptures, and then the video at the end, "She Never Dances Alone," that features Sarah Ortegon, and the music of we see "Now They Are Hallucination." So that song is titled "Sisters," originally by A Tribe Called Red.
You've also received numerous awards, including the MacArthur Fellowship. How have these recognitions impacted your career and your approach to art?
I mean, with the MacArthur, I think, it's just the financial stability that it's able to provide during, I think for a lot of the artists who receive it during a really crucial period. It's like the money enables you to rise to some of the opportunities that are coming at you that otherwise, people can give you a great opportunity, but if it's not supported very well, you can't really realize your best. And so I think what something like the MacArthur Fellowship does is it enables you to bring in support for yourself in a way that, and that could mean many things. It could mean purchasing a studio. It could mean purchasing a home. It could mean equipment or, assistance. It could mean lots of things. But I do think it comes at a time when, and 5 years is how long the money is dispersed to you over. So that's also a significant amount of time that as a person, you can actually change. You can actually make significant changes. I think the outside recognition is really interesting. The MacArthur is interesting because the list of artists who receive it are actually not that long. Visual artists. It's split between architects and scientists, and and so I think it is kind of a weird recognition. I say weird because I think it is a big deal in the art world, but it's also a big deal in museum world. It's a big deal in cultural worlds. It's not always and only about the visual arts. But it's hugely helpful. I mean, I think it was another. I wasn't a first in that way, but it's been nice to see additional Indigenous artists, visual artists, receive that award in the years since. And I can say, I mean, for me, the MacArthur has really shown I know what they're paying attention to. Sometimes I have some idea. I feel like they have really begun to pay attention to Indigenous creative folks, and are trying to ensure that representation is there.
You've also co-edited the landmark volume, An Indigenous Present. Can you tell us about the inspiration behind that project and what it aims to achieve?
Yeah, I think that book probably was something that if I could have just snapped my fingers in the early 2000s, I would have said this book needs to exist. I was living in New York City. I was struggling to find a community of Native artists in New York City who I felt kinship with. I did meet Raven Chacon in 2008. I met Brad Kallhammer probably, I don't know, before 2005. Laura Ortman and I met in 2005. Nicholas Gallinen, Erica Lord, and I met around 2007. These were all meetings in primarily New York City. And I think we'd go to each other's events. You know, you could go to each other's events, but there wasn't really like a collective. And I think the idea of an intertribal kind of hive brain of like urban, you know, what we would call urban Indians at the time, I think was something that I was like, okay, if I had to sit in like in a collective, like that's where I would be. I also got the Idle George Fellowship in 2009. And that began to feel a bit more like somebody who was like bringing together like Indigenous contemporary artists, showing work that sometimes was really conceptually driven, sometimes was more traditionally driven, mixed media across the board. We were showing up for each other. People would come to each other's exhibitions. So I think it was just, and then since then, and that's kind of when I met Kathleen. I met Kathleen in 2002, Kathleen Esch-Milby. And we would have these conversations about when are we going to get to break away from these like stereotypes? When does that happen? When do we get to become our own thing? And we would go to different symposiums. And at some point, I just had to stop going because I just felt like they became limiting somehow. So that's, if I could have snapped my fingers, somebody else would have made the book and it would have happened much earlier. So here comes 2023. The book still wasn't made yet in the way that I saw it. There was lots of writing in academic journals, papers that were published, where I feel like Native artists' work was oftentimes shown, you know, as like maybe a quarter of the page as an illustration for an essay. And I was like, no, where did we get like our big sexy book? When did we get our big sexy book where the images like fill the entire page? And I can just get lost in that book, like sitting there in a comfortable chair, flipping through and looking at beautiful artwork. And so that was basically the idea. It took a lot of work. It took 2.5 years. My co-editor, Janelle Porter, she and her partner have made art books. She's a curator who I worked with in 2013 on my first museum solo exhibition at the ICA in Boston. And yeah, we did all of these studio visits, these virtual studio visits with people. We chose the work. We worked with Sebastian Alban, who is a Cree designer who lives in Montreal, and then we got funding from the Mellon Foundation, which is really what enabled us to be able to make the book really as I envisioned it. You know, I didn't have to wait for permission so much anymore. And I think, to be honest, people thought the book was going to fail because it's an expensive book to make. It's very heavy. It's like 6.5 pounds. And we were also able to secure money to send out copies to different kinds of heritage centers and teachers and mentors to a lot of the artists in the book. And now I think, if I'm not mistaken, we're definitely going into our 4th reprinting. We might be going into our 5th.
That's fantastic.
So it's really been a huge success. And that I'm incredibly proud of. Incredibly proud of it. You know, I really wanted to capture this particular moment where there's so many artists working. There's also a number of artists who I think during their careers, there just wasn't really a context for them to really, for their work to really like be very visible, you know? So now we have, you know, artists working in the market. We have artists working academically. We have artists working conceptually, working traditionally. And this just seemed like the right time to kind of capture all of this into a way, something beautiful that is physically demanding, right? The scale of the book is like, it's a beautifully designed book. And I just, when I had to express to everybody, you know, in the publishing of it, you know, it was like, this just doesn't exist. Like, we just never get to see ourselves in these beautiful books, like these beautiful, like photographic spreads, and see our work really well presented. And I think in the beginning, a lot of the artists maybe didn't understand that really was one of the goals. But when they saw the book, we got so many amazing reactions. People were like, "Thank you for doing this book. Thank you for putting my work in this context." Like, and we also wanted all of the writers to really write from like what they wanted to write from a firsthand perspective. It's like we didn't give them necessarily prompts to respond to or ask them to like talk about this moment, but really to talk about like their experience of like people who have been involved in Indigenous arts now for at least over a decade. You know, it's just sort of like, what do you see happening? Why do you think all of this attention is happening right now? And yeah, I'm super happy with the book.
Hmm. So your work spans various media and techniques. Can you share a little bit about your creative process? How do you decide which medium to use for a particular concept?
You know, I've been fortunately really, we've been very busy in the studio for a number of years now. Right now, I think after Venice, I've tried to really like step back a little bit and let things take a little bit more time. My default return is always painting. I will always have an idea to go and start making a painting. Sometimes that just starts with a color. I do work with a team of people here. So I have people who work on paintings, people who work on sculptures. I meet with them a lot. I'm trying to be more physically involved in every aspect of the making of the work now. That's becoming more and more important to me. And I think it usually from the paintings, and now actually drawing, I started doing a lot of drawing. Drawing is wonderful because it's sort of like you can have an impulsive idea and I can just kind of go with it. Like if I want to draw a figure, you know, transforming into a fox, like I can just do that, you know, and that eventually finds its way maybe into a sculpture. It finds its way into a print. It finds its way. We work with a lot of textiles. We have a couple of exhibitions coming up, and I'm trying to give myself as much room as I can to experiment and play. So we produce a lot of materials. I'll go in and kind of literally physically play with them and place them and pin things on and photograph them and print the photographs out and draw on top of them. And then at some point, usually to do with time and deadlines, I have to decide what I'm going to do. Like, you know, I always try to build in a moment of experimentation and play, but then there's always, I have to remember how long things take to finish. And so at some point I've got to shut down the playground and like get to work, you know, like finishing things.
Yeah. What role do you believe that art plays in preserving and promoting Indigenous cultures?
I think it's amazing. I mean, I think I'm hoping, you know, I talk a lot about dying lately, and I have no intention of going anywhere, but I hope that when I'm gone, I hope that I leave behind a trail that, you know, some young Indigenous person, creative person who maybe feels, in my case, who feels like trapped or like, you know, what's available to me. I hope that I leave behind a trail of documented artworks and conversations that I've had with people that show them that they can pretty much go wherever they want to go. You know, that they, as an Indigenous person, like they can move around this world in the way that they want to. I do think that there is a tremendous amount of knowledge to be gained by listening to our ancestors and to our elders. But ultimately, you can take those with you as you move around the world. You know, I do think that I value so much what Indigenous thought and knowledge provides for us in terms of listening and being able to have an intentional relationship to the world around us. I would say that's one of the key things that I try to practice in a way that I see as different from some of my peers who are artists. You know, it's, to me, I do believe that I'm making things that have the ability to manifest, you know, so whether it's through language, whether it's through pattern, through color, I do believe and in particular, probably for more than a decade now, thinking about speaking to other Indigenous people who are looking at my artwork, you know. And in the beginning, it used to be like, well, what if they're not there? And it was like, and my dad used to say this to me. He was like, he used to say, like, oh, if you make the paintings, they'll come. And it just sounded so corny. But now I kind of believe it. It's like, you have to make work for the audience that you want to see show up. You know, I would say this, I say the same thing to institutions. I'm like, if you want Native people to come, you need to like show things that they're interested in. You need to show things that are relevant to them. Yeah. Otherwise, yeah, they're not coming.
Yeah.
So I think my hope is that we document almost everything. We're documenting things more and more and more here in the studio. We keep a ton of things, and my hope is to leave behind, like I said, just a trail of things that somebody. One of the goals of the collaborations that I do is really to kind of, again, leave behind a trail of people who I've interacted with, even in minor ways. You know, it's like you're looking at Jeffrey Gibson, all of a sudden you realize it's like, oh, he collaborated with this person like 3 times. I'm going to look into Ariel Twist. And suddenly you discover like Ariel Twist is this incredible trans matriarch Cree poet, you know, and really intense. Like, and maybe from there you come across Kahele, who is like, lives here locally, who is a DJ, who is like, and Kanaka DJ. And you're like, I had no idea, you know, it's like that these things happened, and they happened at an exhibition organized by Candace Hopkins at Bard College that celebrated the beginning of the Institute of American Indian Arts. Like, there's just this kind of unfolding trail that I wish I had known about. You know, I didn't know about it. These are things that I actively look for now, but really had to show up in my life in some way. I want to make that easier for people.
So looking ahead, but not that far ahead, what projects and themes are you most excited to explore in your next work?
Well, I'm getting ready to open an exhibition at Mass MoCA, so the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Adams, Massachusetts. And they have a space which they refer to as Building 5. It's about a 20,000 square foot building, and they give it over to an artist to take over. So they invited me probably about 4.5, 5 years ago, and due to COVID, things got bumped around. Now we're opening in November. There's about 40 Indigenous, queer, not everybody identifies as queer, but Indigenous, primarily Indigenous, queer, creative people collaborating, activating the space in different ways over the 18 months that it'll be open. And I really, you know, I came across this video online. It was made in 1991, and it's about the term Two-Spirit. And so it's a documentary that documents about 5 individuals in Oakland, California in 1991, and they're describing the term Two-Spirit as it relates to them. Now, the story is that the term Two-Spirit originates at an academic conference in Canada in 1990, I believe. And so for me, what's interesting is that this term Two-Spirit is still with us, and it's only grown, right? Like, people really embrace it in a different way than when it first originated. So a lot of people have actually moved beyond the term Two-Spirit, and they've found that term in their own language, in their own communities. Some people we've spoken to have like moved home to reestablish that role in their community. And so that's kind of formed the core of the exhibition. A lot of video, a lot of sound. There's some new garments that we're making here in the studio. There's a lot of light elements that happen. It's kind of funny when we work on projects this large, because the first time I'll see it all come together is like when everyone else sees it all come together. Like, there's no way for us to like test it out beforehand. So that's coming up, and that's been really exciting. And let me see what else is happening. Oh, the Met facade. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art has like these 4 niches on the front of the building, and they commission artists annually at this point to create new sculptures for the facade of the Met. And I will debut 4 new sculptures on the front of the Met in fall 2025.
Congratulations.
So I'm working on those right now. Thank you.
That's
Thank
fantastic.
You. And those are really, I'm loving doing them, but it is really also another kind of like challenge, right? It's sort of like, it's going to be such a prominent, very public space. And, just to try to figure out like, what do you want to make? It's like, and with a tight deadline. So that's what I'm doing.
Oh, wow. So reflecting back on your career, what has been some of the more rewarding moments for you as an artist?
That's a really tough question, actually. I mean, I have to say, I feel incredibly grateful, and I feel really incredibly fortunate for it's not that I haven't worked really hard. It's not that I haven't, put in the time and done the work and all this other stuff. It's just that I know so many artists who also work really hard, who put in the time and put in the work. And there's just no way of telling how it all comes together, I feel really grateful that I'm able to work with people who I enjoy being around, that I'm able to realize what my mind is thinking about. I love artists. I love the other artists who I get to be involved in any way in their world. I think some of the most meaningful moments probably really have to do with more personal relationships. Like I love that like Chief Philip Martin funded my education. I mean, the Choctaw Nation funded my education. That is something that is literally kind of like a crucial core pin in my story, that had they not decided to do that, I don't know if I could have gone to London to study, And it's something incredibly different. I didn't incur a debt by them paying for it. In fact, I wanted to return to the reservation to pay them back. I wanted to return to the reservation and teach art. And at the time, Chief Martin said to me, he said, there's no reason for you to return here because we can't support what you do. He said he had a financial plan for the tribe, which was about skill building, trade skill building. And so he's like, we've cut all arts education for now, and we're focusing on employment. And by the end of the 90s, they had shifted the employment rate of the entire state, that the Choctaw Nation was the largest employer.
Wow.
And we had surplus jobs to community members. So that was his goal, right? And now when this happened recently since Venice, is I will begin contributing to the art programs at the high school on the reservation, and in hopes that will show students that they don't have to become artists, but just the idea of like building creativity, I think, is something through practice is something that we hope to support. Those are the things that are really meaningful.
Yeah. So how do you keep yourself inspired and motivated in your creative practice? Are there any routines or sources of inspiration you turn to?
It's kind of funny. I feel like I just have a ton of ideas. They just never, I should be knocking on wood. I don't want to like curse myself, but I really, I feel like there's so many things that I haven't done yet. There's so many things that it's more a question of like, can I do them the way that I envision doing them? I mean, even with the paintings, like it's funny, there's like things happening in the studio right now with paintings that I wouldn't have known how to do like 4 or 5 years ago. It just wouldn't have occurred to me, I mean, and then I enjoy having conversations with people because they put words to what I'm doing in a way that I'm not sure I would have arrived at. So for instance, recently, I use a lot of text in my work. one of the things people are familiar with is these letter forms that I created that show up in the paintings. They show up in prints. They're in Venice. And then I wanted to eventually, because I really liked the way handwriting looks, but I hated my own handwriting. So probably about 3 years ago now, I was like, you know what? I'm going to practice my handwriting regularly. I'm going to learn to like my handwriting. So I've been practicing it, and I finally like my handwriting. And so now we're printing it into the paintings. And someone reminded me the other day that the idea of like handwriting analysis, that our handwriting says so much about who we are. And not only just who our personalities are, but like our brains connected to our bodies and our sense of identity that comes through in our handwriting. And they were like, it's really very, and also the other thing that I wanted to do is I've been known for quoting a lot of text out in the world. And I'm determined right now to do the writing myself, to author the statements myself. And so that's what's showing up in the work right now. And I know I wouldn't have been able to do that like 3 to 5 years ago. And so now there's this whole thing about like writing and a writing practice and like, what can I describe in words?
Well, Jeffrey, this has been a joy, and I've absolutely enjoyed speaking with you today. Thank you so much for this. Is there anything you would like to share with our listeners before we go?
I don't know. I thank you for listening. I don't know. I always feel really grateful that people are interested. I mean, I like I said, I feel very, very fortunate that I get to do what I do, and I'm really grateful for even people being interested to learn more, to see it, to listen. It's such a privilege.
Well, thank you again for joining us. We look forward to seeing where your creative journey takes you next.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through Indigenous art and creativity. Stay inspired and keep exploring with us on Beyond the Art.
Remember to subscribe and follow us for more exclusive interviews, insightful discussions, and stories that ignite your artistic imagination.
Until next time, continue to unlock your limitless potential with Beyond the Art. Thank you for listening.